We're very excited to have our colleague Jessica Streit with us today to review the methods and results from a recent strategic foresight exercise conducted by NIOSH to explore how future pandemics and other sudden disruptions might impact work and jobs and shape the practice of occupational safety and health. Jessica is the Deputy Director for the NIOSH Office of Research Integration, and in this role, she contributes to leadership for key NIOSH efforts in the areas of strategic foresight, expanding research partnerships, and intramural research administration. Jessica has also co-authored a number of publications and presentations examining occupational safety and health risks and hazards for workers today and in the future. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Streit. Jessica?
Thank you, Sarah. It's really my pleasure to be here on this side of the podium today to present the methods and findings from the recent NIOSH Sudden Disruptions Foresight Project, which we call SDFP for short. I'd like to start my presentation by recognizing the SDFP team for their 8-month dedication to the project. Their scientific and creative contributions coming from the individuals from NIOSH and the University of Houston who participated in the project were really essential to the success of the SDFP. And I'd also like to acknowledge the senior scientists and thought leaders from NIOSH who shared their occupational safety and health knowledge with the SDFP as our subject matter expert interview and workshop panel. So to start, let's talk about why NIOSH decided to embark on the SDFP. A major precipitating event was the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we all know, represented a significant disruption to work and working people. The effects of COVID-19 for the U.S. labor force came on suddenly, beginning in March 2020, and almost immediately and lasting well into the pandemic. The vast majority of employed adults in the U.S. found themselves making unanticipated changes to how they perform their jobs. There was very little time for employers or workers to prepare for wearing masks and respirators, for practicing social distancing, working remotely, or completing things like daily symptom checklists before these really became mandated norms in the world of work. Massive shutdowns, COVID-related business closures, falling export demands, and other factors also contributed to significant disruptive decreases in the number of low and medium wage jobs that were available across all industries. Thankfully, domestic and international infection rates have declined over time, and protection against circulating variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 have since improved. And as a result, in May 2023, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 is no longer a public health emergency of international concern. And so, though most national emergency declarations have ended, global experts agree that COVID-19 will have lasting impacts worldwide for many aspects of life. Specific to work, some of those anticipated long-term effects from COVID-19 include a significant rise in long-term remote work arrangements, an increase in independent, non-collaborative job tasks, rapid adoption of things like digitalization, e-commerce platforms, automation, and artificial intelligence, a markedly different mix of occupations with a significant decline in food service, customer sales, and office support jobs, and an increase in employment opportunities in areas like e-commerce, the delivery economy, healthcare, and the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM professions. And also, we anticipate seeing new challenges for workers who must transition from lower wage jobs into higher paying occupations that require more advanced cognitive, technical, and emotional skills. Now, many discussions and thought pieces about the future of work have come out in recent years and often reflect on one or more of these long-term work-related effects of COVID-19. But within NIOSH, we have also begun to raise questions about the potential for additional disruptive events in the future, what they might be, how they might unfold, and what implications they may have for working people in the occupational safety and health community. And elsewhere, we see others in the occupational safety and health community engaging in similar lines of inquiry. In a 2021 publication on the future of work, for example, colleagues from the University of Central Florida and Australian Catholic University concluded that it's important for us to consider not only the new work trends and practices that are resulting from COVID-19, but also how additional disruptive events might influence how these trends unfold over time. The need to consider the impact of additional future disruptions becomes particularly salient when we consider the current status of futures preparedness around the world. A recent Global Health Security Index assessment provides evidence of widespread underpreparedness, or a lack of comprehensive preparedness, for additional pandemics and other disruptive events in the future. The average score for national public health preparedness in 2021 was just 38.9 out of a possible 100 points. In the accompanying map shown here on this slide, there's a sliding scale of color that represents 5 different preparedness tiers. No countries across the world placed in the top preparedness tier of this scale, indicating significant public health preparedness gaps across all 195 countries. Bringing our focus in a little from looking at preparedness at the country level, we see that organizations demonstrate a similar widespread underpreparedness for future disruptions. The majority of CEOs and C-suite executives surveyed by the conference board just last year in 2022 indicated their organizations are not well prepared for a variety of potential disruptive future events. Only around 50% felt their organizations were well prepared for future cybersecurity threats or public health crises. And the numbers dropped staggeringly when it came to other types of events like organizational preparedness for economic turmoil, extreme climate events, food or water shortages, and terrorism or war. And then again, bringing things in just a little bit, looking at the individual level, we also see a display of a general underpreparedness for disruptions in the future. Around 60% of adults that were surveyed in 2022 reported either having no family emergency preparedness plan in place or not knowing if their family has any type of plan in place. And this chronic and widespread unreadiness for future at the national, organizational, and individual levels leaves us unnecessarily susceptible to the adverse effects of a wide variety of sudden disruptions that may occur. While pandemics are one example, other disruptions include things like non-communicable public emergencies, terrorist attacks, cyber attacks and war, power outages and major industrial or engineering accidents, and natural disasters. And these abrupt disturbances can significantly alter or interrupt routine activities, including work and jobs, with very little advanced warning. Remaining unprepared for their occurrence places the safety, health, and well-being of working people, their families, and their communities at risk. As a U.S. federal agency, NIOSH is well positioned to help address this vulnerability of underpreparedness. And in recent years, NIOSH has invested resources to build capacity in strategic foresight, a futures-oriented practice that helps individuals and organizations understand, prepare for, and influence the future. At its core, foresight involves identifying, assessing, and monitoring weak and early signals of coming change. And the activities are designed to help us answer the important question of what if, rather than trying to predict what's next. And in this way, exercises in foresight can expand how we think about and plan for the future. There's a growing body of qualitative and quantitative evidence that demonstrates a link between foresight and a number of positive organizational outcomes, including improved performance, enhanced innovation, and increased preparedness for future risks and issues. In early 2022, the NIOSH Office of Research Integration assembled a team of volunteers to conduct a qualitative foresight project to help enhance our organization's future readiness. And the purpose of this project, known as the SDFP, was to explore how sudden disruptions might impact the future practice of occupational safety and health. The team members that I recognized at the beginning of this presentation brought diverse expert viewpoints from advanced technologies, the future of work, health communications, injury prevention, occupational safety and health policy and regulations, and strategic foresight to the SDFP. All of our work on the SDFP was guided by the Foresight Framework for Occupational Safety and Health. This framework is an OSH-specific adaptation of the University of Houston's internationally recognized and discipline-neutral framework Foresight. And the framework consists of a sequence of 6 action-oriented stages: framing the topic of interest, scanning for evidence or what we call signals of change, futuring scenarios from that evidence that we find, visioning what the implications and options might be for specific clients, designing strategies for the future, and then monitoring for new evidence related to our project topic. And together, these stages generate a set of evidence-based scenarios, a comprehensive analysis of the implications and impacts of those scenarios, and a responsive strategic plan. So our first output from the framing stage of the SDFP is what's called a domain map, which organized the main project topic of disruptive changes to work and jobs into 5 primary topics: work arrangements, employment patterns, work-related risks and hazards, workforce availability, and workplace regulation. And these were intended to represent 5 primary characteristics of work and jobs that might be impacted by disruptive changes in the future and might have implications for how we approach the practice of occupational safety and health. Each of these topics was then further defined by a list of specific subtopics, and these gave us a useful list of key words to use in our remaining activities of the SDFP. Our exploration of the SDFP domain map and its topics began with a current assessment, which describes recent key historical events and the present-day context for the practice of occupational safety and health. This was not intended to be a comprehensive or systematic review of the state of occupational safety and health, but the current assessment helps establish a baseline for the relevant conditions that have influenced how the OSH community responds to disruptive events, the key OSH interest groups that we should keep in mind when we think about the future, and examples of major 21st century disruptions that clearly required an OSH response. The topics and subtopics from the domain map then became our keywords for an in-depth search and review of print and internet-based resources on the topic of sudden disruptions and their influence on occupational safety and health. And through this scanning activity, we located and cataloged over 240 relevant signals of change, or pieces of evidence about how the future might be different from today. And most of these signals related to the disruptions and their potential impacts to work, workers, and the practice of occupational safety and health over the next 15 years, although some did go out as far as 2050. As a complement to that comprehensive scan, we also conducted a series of semi-structured key informant interviews with 12 NIOSH senior leaders and scientists. And these individuals are recognized contributors to the occupational safety and health field for their expertise in one or more of the topics that were noted in the SDFP domain map. We held virtual 30-minute one-on-one conversations with these experts in April and May of 2022. And our conversations with them were guided by a series of predetermined questions that were written according to a well-established approach for Foresight interviewing. In the context of the SDFP and focusing on sudden disruptions, the questions were tailored to focus on successes and failures in preparing the OSH workforce for past disruptions, and trends, decisions, and obstacles that may impact how we prepare the OSH workforce for future disruptions. The SDFP team systematically analyzed the interview transcripts for themes and then combined those themes with our scanning results to identify higher level commonalities that were captured by both of our data collection methods. We expressed the common threads among the interviews and our scanning data as 15 drivers of change, or factors that will affect or shape how occupational safety and health responds to disruptive events in the future. Each SDFP team member used a 3-point scale to independently evaluate the uncertainty of how each driver might unfold across the future. So 1 indicated a trajectory that was highly uncertain, and 3 indicated a trajectory that was mostly predetermined. And these independent evaluations were averaged to calculate a final uncertainty score for each driver. The drivers were then ranked by degree of perceived uncertainty. And as shown in this table, fast education was considered the most uncertain of the 15 drivers. This driver describes a possible shift from traditional classroom-based academic programs of study to more skills-based, rapid readiness, and on-the-job training programs. In contrast, in the number 15 space, we see the systemic stress driver, which describes increasing stress levels for individuals, families, and communities. This was considered the most certain of the 15 drivers. From the list of the 15 drivers, we identified key uncertainties or high impact issues that are expected to influence the practice of occupational safety and health in currently undetermined directions in the future. And to generate the uncertainties, the SDFP team focused specifically on the top 9 drivers in the list. Through discussion, the team unanimously agreed the trajectories for these drivers are, in fact, uncertain with respect to both their direction and magnitude as we move into the future. The team also unanimously agreed to exclude the other 6 drivers on the list because the evidence that we had collected through our scanning and interviews suggested that either their direction or their magnitude of change is mostly certain as we move into the future. Because those top 9 drivers represent uncertainties or unknowns about the future, the team reframed the core concept from each of those drivers into a yet to be answered key question. This process generated a list of 9 critical questions about the future of OSH training programs, organized labor, public trust in government, the global supply chain, regulatory policy and practice, social connectedness due to technology, automation in the workplace, health and safety management, and health equity. And 2 responses for each uncertainty question were intentionally written as extreme opposing possible outcomes, recognizing that the future that actually comes to be could fall anywhere along the resulting continuum. The real future for OSH workforce training under uncertainty number 1, for example, could fall anywhere on the spectrum from purely traditional post-secondary education programs to exclusively employer-based on-the-job training. Likewise, the real future under uncertainty number 9 on this list could fall anywhere on a spectrum where the remote economy either worsens occupational health disparities and inequities or promotes equity for all members of a diverse workforce. The list of 9 uncertainty questions served as the primary input to our futuring efforts in stage 3 of the project. In this stage, we invited the key informant interviewees back to participate in a subject matter expert virtual workshop, which took place over 2 days in June 2022. On day 1, we engaged the experts in an exercise to assign a priority rank to each of the uncertainties. And the experts ranked trust in government, social connectedness, and workforce health and safety as the top 3 uncertainties that might influence the OSH response to future disruptions. We constructed a series of 3 2x2 matrices using different combinations of those top 3 uncertainties as the X and Y axes. The dichotomized response options to each of the uncertainty questions became the label for the polar extremes on each of the axes. And we then compared and contrasted the 3 resulting matrices. And the goal of this comparison activity was to identify the best matrix for building scenarios or stories about the future. So for each possible matrix option, we reflected on a series of assessment questions. Can each quadrant of the matrix be readily named? Is each quadrant in the matrix plausible? Are the quadrants produced by the matrix meaningfully different from one another? And do the quadrants of the matrix suggest real challenges that we may face as we prepare the OSH workforce for sudden disruptions in the future? Through a discussion-based assessment exercise, the experts ultimately selected option 1, which was defined by the trust in government and workforce health and safety uncertainties as the best matrix for scenario building. And this 2x2 matrix provides 4 quadrants with some preliminary scenario boundaries. So the y-axis sets the boundaries for the role of trust in government. In scenario A and D, in those top two quadrants, government agencies have regained their reputation as trusted sources of health information for the public. And in scenarios B and C, in the bottom two quadrants, individual influencers have become the main source of health information for the public. And then the x-axis sets the boundaries for workplace health and safety in these possible scenarios. In the quadrants for scenarios A and B, health and safety remains an employer responsibility. And in scenarios C and D, managing safety and health has become an individual responsibility for members of a more mobile and distributed workforce. Day 2 of the workshop had the participating experts break out into discussion groups to brainstorm explanations of how all the remaining uncertainties from our list of 9 and our drivers from that full list of 15 might play out into each of these future quadrants that were defined by this 2x2 matrix. And from those small group discussions, we constructed a full story narrative of about 500 words for each quadrant in the matrix. And for the sake of time today, I'll share just the title and a short one-line description for each of the 4 futures that were developed. Scenario A was titled Trusted Partnerships. This story focuses on a future in which the United States government regains its reputation as a trusted source of health information, and it works closely with employers who remain responsible for the health and safety of their workforce and workplace. Scenario B was titled The Multipolar World of OSH. In this future story, both employers and the government lobby individual influencers who have become inconsistent centers of workplace health and safety information. Mixed messaging perpetuates inconsistent application of the general duty clause of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. Scenario C, Race to the Bottom, is another future story in which individual influencers have replaced the government as the trusted source for health information, but individuals, rather than employers, have become stewards of their own health and safety. And finally, scenario D, Rugged Individualism and Trustworthy Government, tells the story of a future where workers in certain sectors thrive under a new regulatory framework while others bear the burden. Employers are liberated from liability, but the government has more resources to pursue health and safety efforts for the general public. So the point of developing scenarios like these is not just to write interesting stories about potential futures that we might experience. Each scenario also provides a picture of the future that we can analyze to better understand and articulate the critical issues, risks, and challenges that we may face over time. So to help identify the challenges that were implied by the 4 scenarios generated by the SDFP, we reconvened our expert interviewees one more time for a final 4-hour workshop in August 2022. And that workshop was really key to the visioning stage of the Foresight framework and consisted of 3 structured activities. Those activities helped us to identify the critical impacts and issues that were implied by each of the future scenarios that we had written. And after completing the workshop and reflecting on the results, we categorized the issues identified across all 4 scenarios into 3 main topics. First, ensuring data access for OSH research and practice through periods of disruption. Second, managing OSH as an individual worker responsibility. And third, communicating accurate information effectively to different audiences. And it's worth noting that each of these topics had also been represented in some form among the gaps and challenges that we identified in our current assessment of sort of our baseline situation that we completed when we were first framing the project. And that connection between the present and the future really reinforced the importance of acting now to address these issues as part of our efforts to prepare the occupational safety and health workforce for future disruptions. OSH research and practice organizations, for example, might use the key issues that we identified through the SDFP as a guide when they're strategically preparing for the future. Robust plans might consider including elements that strengthen our capacity to support data access, allow for efficient and effective research and communications to individuals, and combat mis, dis, and malinformation during periods of potential disruption. It might also be helpful to articulate longer-term strategic objectives for each of these topics and then backcast or work backwards from the long-term objective to identify a sequenced roadmap of actions that increase organizational preparedness for these issues. And those sequenced actions that are identified on the roadmap can then be prioritized and pursued according to the organizational needs and resource availability. Now, as with all research projects, there are certain factors that should be considered when interpreting the findings of the SDFP. Most notably, the SDFP was designed with NIOSH as our primary client or end user in mind for our findings. And because of this, we focused primarily on disruptive changes that could impact work in the US, and we solicited expert input from NIOSH senior scientists and leaders. To provide some counterbalance to that NIOSH focused perspective, we did include both domestic and international resources in our scanning exercise. And doing this helped us design scenario narratives that depict 4 broad future contexts. These are futures in which not only NIOSH, but other OSH organizations could potentially exist. So while the SDFP was primarily conducted for NIOSH, the scenarios and key issues we have extracted may also serve as useful inputs to planning efforts within other organizations and might be adaptable to other cultural contexts as well. And so I'll close the formal presentation of today's webinar just with a quick recap of what we on the SDFP team considered to be the key takeaways from the project and what would be the key takeaways from today's presentation. First and foremost, even with all the advanced surveillance and forecasting techniques that are available to us today, it's really impossible to know with certainty what the future will be, especially when it comes to the future of work or the occurrence and impacts of sudden disruptions. Strategic foresight is a practice that can help us expand our OSH toolbox and combat some of this uncertainty. Foresight is designed to help us think about what the future could reasonably be based on evidence and expert opinion that we collect today. And analyzing the information and the evidence-based scenarios that we can create during the foresight process can help us identify important issues that have the potential to significantly impact work, working people, and the practice of occupational safety and health. For the SDFP, those issues centered around the topics of data access, individual level OSH management, and communication approaches during disruptions in the coming years. Having these insights in hand can give some direction to and strengthen our efforts to prepare the OSH community for the uncertain future. And beyond the topic of disruptions, the step-by-step process that we reviewed today from the SDFP can serve as a general guide or blueprint for additional foresight projects that can investigate a wide variety of subjects and topics that are relevant to the future of occupational safety and health. And finally, as noted in the last stage of the foresight framework for OSH, the practice of strategic foresight is not a one and done activity. Successful completion of the last 2 stages of the framework, which focus on implementing strategies and then monitoring for additional evidence of change over time, requires support and participation from the broader occupational safety and health community. The commitment of time and resources to foresight activities now can help expand and enhance the efficacy of our domestic and international efforts to think about, prepare for, and influence the safety, health, and well-being of workers today and into the future. Together, we can institutionalize a proactive and forward-facing approach to the practice of occupational safety and health. References cited in this presentation are provided for any who may be interested in learning more about some of the things that we discussed today, which includes not only sudden disruptions and their potential impact to the practice of occupational safety and health, but also the practice of strategic foresight more broadly. And of course, the NIOSH Office of Research Integration welcomes your feedback and questions on our work and our plans to continue leveraging the practice of strategic foresight for the benefit of worker safety, health, and well-being. And with that, I will thank the audience very much for their time and attention for the formal presentation and turn things back to Sarah.
Thank you, Jessica, for sharing that great example of how strategic foresight can be applied to help us expand our strategic planning efforts by considering how sudden disruptions impact the future practice of occupational safety and health. We welcome anyone interested in learning more about how NIOSH is working to advance the role of foresight in occupational safety and health research, service, and practice to visit the Strategic Foresight at NIOSH webpage available at the URL on the screen.